What happens when a former president walks into what he thinks is a friendly interview, only to face the most intense questioning of his entire career? The tension in this NBC News studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what unfolded over the next hour would leave both the host and the guest at each other's throats in ways nobody saw coming. Before we dive into this absolute powder keg of an interview, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you are on after watching this. Because trust me, you are going to have some strong opinions by the end of this video. The interview started innocently enough. Donald Trump sat across from veteran NBC journalist Margaret Brennan in a studio setup that had been arranged weeks in advance. The lighting was perfect, the cameras were rolling, and both parties seemed ready for what was supposed to be a standard political interview. But within the first 60 seconds, it became crystal clear that this was going to be anything but standard. Margaret opened with a seemingly straightforward question. "Mr. President, you have made numerous claims about the economy during your previous administration. Can you walk us through the specific policies that you believe led to the economic growth you often reference?" Trump leaned forward slightly, that familiar confident expression crossing his face. "Well, Margaret, I am glad you asked that because nobody, and I mean nobody, has done more for the American economy than I did. We had the greatest economy in the history of this country. The stock market was at record highs. Unemployment was at record lows, especially for African Americans and Hispanic Americans. We brought back manufacturing jobs that previous administrations said were never coming back." Margaret nodded, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was not going to let this be a simple victory lap. "Mr. President, those are broad claims. Can you point to specific legislation or executive orders that directly caused these outcomes? Because many economists argue that you inherited a growing economy from the previous administration and that the trends simply continued." And there it was, the first spark that would eventually ignite into a full-blown confrontation. Trump's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around his eyes that anyone who had watched him over the years would recognize as a warning sign. "Well, Margaret, I find it interesting that you would parrot the talking points of the fake news media. We did not just inherit an economy, we supercharged it. The tax cuts alone, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that was all me, all my administration. We cut regulations that were strangling American businesses. We renegotiated terrible trade deals like NAFTA, which became the USMCA. These were not just continuations, these were revolutionary changes." Margaret maintained her composure, her pen tapping lightly against her notepad. "The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, let us talk about that specifically." Independent analysis from the Congressional Budget Office showed that while it did provide some short-term economic stimulus, it also added significantly to the national debt and primarily benefited corporations and wealthy individuals. How do you respond to those findings? Trump's jaw tightened. Here we go again with the so-called independent analysis. Margaret, let me tell you something about these so-called independent organizations. They are run by people who have never built a business, never created a job, never had to make payroll. They sit in their ivory towers and they crunch numbers, but they do not understand real-world economics. The tax cuts put money back in the pockets of hardworking Americans and allowed businesses to expand and hire more workers. "But the data shows," Margaret interjected, her tone still measured but gaining an edge, "that wage growth for middle-class workers remained relatively stagnant while corporate profits soared. Can you explain that discrepancy?" The temperature in the room seemed to rise several degrees. Trump shifted in his seat, and his famous hand gestures began to animate his responses more dramatically. "Margaret, you are cherry-picking data. You are taking certain statistics and ignoring others. If you look at the complete picture, real wages were rising. Consumer confidence was at an all-time high. People felt good about the economy. You can throw statistics at me all day long, but the American people knew they were better off under my administration than they had been in decades." Margaret pressed forward without missing a beat. "Let us move to another topic that has been central to your political identity: immigration. You have consistently claimed that the border was more secure during your presidency than at any other time in history. However, government data shows that illegal border crossings fluctuated significantly during your term, and that many of the policies you implemented faced legal challenges and were ultimately struck down by courts. How do you square your claims with that reality? This was the moment when the interview shifted from tense to explosive. Trump's face flushed slightly and his voice rose in volume. Margaret, you know what? I agreed to come on this show because I thought we were going to have an honest conversation. But what you are doing right now is exactly what the mainstream media always does. You take complex issues, you strip away all the context, and you try to make it sound like everything I did was wrong or ineffective. The border was more secure under my administration because we had policies in place that actually deterred illegal immigration. We built the wall, we implemented Remain in Mexico, we ended catch and release. These policies worked. Margaret did not back down. But, Mr. President, those policies were challenged in court specifically because they violated existing immigration law and international treaty obligations regarding asylum seekers. Multiple federal judges, including some appointed by Republican presidents, struck down these policies. Are all of those judges wrong? Trump leaned forward, his finger pointing for emphasis. Margaret, let me tell you about these judges. Many of them are activists who legislate from the bench. They impose their own political views instead of interpreting the law as it is written. We won many of these cases on appeal, and the policies that we put in place were upheld by higher courts. But you do not want to talk about that, do you? You want to focus on the initial rulings that fit your narrative. The back and forth continued with increasing intensity. Margaret brought up the issue of family separations at the border, a policy that had drawn widespread condemnation from human rights organizations and even some members of Trump's own party. Mr. President, thousands of children were separated from their parents at the border under your administration's zero-tolerance policy. Some of these children still have not been reunited with their families. Do you take any responsibility for that humanitarian crisis? Trump's response was immediate and forceful. That policy existed before I took office, Margaret. The Obama administration had similar practices. What we did was enforce the law. If people do not want to be separated from their children, they should not break the law by entering our country illegally. It is that simple. We have laws for a reason. And the problem is that for too long, administrations refuse to enforce those laws. Margaret's response came quickly, her research clearly thorough. Mr. President, that is not accurate. The systematic separation of families as a matter of policy, not just in exceptional circumstances, was a creation of your administration. Your own Attorney General at the time, Jeff Sessions, announced this as a deterrent strategy. How can you claim this was simply a continuation of previous policy? Trump's frustration was becoming more visible. You are twisting my words, Margaret. What I am saying is that the law required us to process people who entered illegally. The separation issue arose because we were actually enforcing the law, unlike previous administrations who just let everyone go and hoped they would show up for court dates, which most of them never did. Let us talk about those court dates, Margaret continued, clearly prepared for this exact response. Data from the Justice Department shows that the majority of asylum seekers who were released with court dates did actually appear for their hearings. Your claims about people not showing up are contradicted by your own government's statistics. The interview was barely 15 minutes in, and already the confrontation had reached a level of intensity rarely seen in mainstream political interviews. Both participants were dug in, neither willing to concede ground, and the real fireworks were just beginning. Trump's eyes narrowed as he processed Margaret's last statement about the court appearance statistics. You know what, Margaret? I have been doing interviews for decades, and I can tell when someone is trying to trap me with selective facts. You throw out one statistic about court appearances, but you conveniently ignore the hundreds of thousands who never even got notices, who disappeared into the interior of the country. That is the real story. Margaret remained calm, flipping through her notes with practiced efficiency. Mr. President, we can provide our viewers with the complete data if you would like. The Department of Homeland Security under your administration tracked these numbers meticulously. Between 2014 and 2019, approximately 75% of non-detained migrants attended their court hearings. That is not a small minority, That is a majority. Trump waved his hand dismissively. Those numbers are cooked, Margaret. I do not know who gave you those figures, but they do not reflect reality. Talk to the Border Patrol agents, talk to ICE officers. They will tell you the truth about what was happening at that border. People were pouring in, committing crimes, trafficking drugs, and yes, many of them disappeared into the country never to be seen again. Let us talk about crime then. Margaret transitioned smoothly. You have repeatedly claimed that undocumented immigrants commit crimes at higher rates than American citizens. However, studies from both conservative and liberal research institutions have consistently shown that undocumented immigrants actually commit crimes at lower rates than native-born Americans. Why do you continue to make claims that are contradicted by empirical evidence? The question landed like a hammer, and Trump's response was explosive. Margaret, this is exactly what I am talking about. You cite these studies, these so-called research institutions, but you know what they do not count? They do not count the crimes that are never reported. They do not count the sanctuary cities that refuse to cooperate with federal law enforcement. Of course, the numbers look different when you are not counting half the crimes that actually occur. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Mr. President, you are suggesting that there is a massive undercount of crimes committed by undocumented immigrants. Do you have evidence to support that claim? Because law enforcement agencies, including those in Republican-controlled jurisdictions, have not substantiated this theory. Trump's voice grew louder. Evidence? Margaret, the evidence is in every angel mom who has lost a child to an illegal immigrant who should never have been in this country. The evidence is in every community that has been devastated by MS-13 gang members who crossed our border. You want to sit here and talk about studies and statistics, but I am talking about real American lives that have been destroyed. Margaret did not flinch. Mr. President, nobody is dismissing the very real tragedies that occur when any person, regardless of immigration status, commits a violent crime. But should not policy be based on accurate data rather than anecdotal cases? If we are going to allocate billions of dollars to border security and immigration enforcement, should not we be honest about what the actual scope of the problem is? Trump pointed directly at Margaret. That is such a typical elitist response. You sit here in your studio, safe and secure, and you tell me that we should not be concerned about these crimes because statistically they are outliers. Tell that to the families who have lost loved ones. Tell that to the communities that have been torn apart. They do not care about your statistics, Margaret. The exchange was becoming increasingly personal, moving beyond policy disagreements into more fundamental conflicts about truth and rhetoric. Margaret took a measured breath before continuing. Mr. President, let us move to another controversial topic. The 2020 election. You have maintained that the election was stolen from you through widespread fraud. Dozens of court cases, including those heard by judges you appointed, found no evidence of fraud sufficient to overturn the results. At what point do you accept the legal determinations of the judicial system? The room seemed to freeze for a moment. This was the question that everyone knew would come, and Trump's reaction did not disappoint. His face reddened and his body language became more aggressive. Margaret, I knew we would get here eventually. This is what you people always want to talk about. You want to put me on the defensive about an election that had more irregularities than any election in American history. You had mail-in ballots flooding the system with no proper verification. You had ballot harvesting in multiple states. You had voting machines that were connected to the internet when they should not have been. These are facts. Margaret responded immediately. Mr. President, election officials from both parties, including many Republicans who supported you, certified those elections as fair and secure. Are you saying that all of these officials, including members of your own party, conspired against you? Trump did not hesitate. I am saying that there were people who were afraid to stand up and tell the truth. I am saying that there was enormous pressure put on election officials to certify results even when they had questions. I am saying that the media, including networks like yours, refused to investigate legitimate concerns about election integrity. Margaret pressed on. Your own Attorney General, William Barr, whom you appointed, stated publicly that there was no evidence of widespread fraud that would have changed the outcome. Your own cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency called it the most secure election in American history. Why should Americans believe your claims over the findings of your own appointees? Trump's frustration boiled over. Bill Barr was wrong, Margaret. He did not do his job. He did not investigate thoroughly enough. And as for the cybersecurity people, they were not even looking at the right things. They were focused on external hacking when the real problems were happening with the internal processes, with the counting, with the verification. Margaret did not let up. Mr. President, can you point to specific evidence that your legal team was unable to present in court? Because the overwhelming majority of these cases were dismissed not on technicalities, but because no credible evidence was presented. This is exactly the problem, Trump shot back. The courts would not even look at the evidence. They dismissed cases on standing. They dismissed cases on procedural grounds. They refused to examine the actual evidence because they were afraid of the political consequences. That is not justice, Margaret. That is cowardice. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both participants speaking over each other at times, voices raised, frustrations evident. The professional veneer of a typical news interview had completely dissolved, replaced by something far more raw and confrontational. Margaret took a deliberate pause, allowing the temperature in the room to settle for just a moment before diving into her next line of questioning. The brief silence was almost more intense than the shouting had been. Mr. President, let us discuss January 6th. You gave a speech that day where you told your supporters to march to the Capitol. What responsibility do you bear for what happened that afternoon? Trump's jaw clenched visibly. Margaret, I told people to march peacefully and patriotically. Those were my exact words. Peacefully and patriotically. But of course the media never plays that clip, do they? They only show the parts that fit their narrative. What happened at the Capitol was terrible, and I have said that many times, but I did not incite it. Margaret reached for a document on her desk. Mr. President, you also told the crowd that day, and I quote, "If you do not fight like hell, you are not going to have a country anymore." You told them that the election had been stolen and that they needed to stop the certification. How is that not incitement? Trump leaned back, his expression defiant. Margaret, politicians use the word fight all the time. Democrats say it, Republicans say it. It is a common expression in politics. When people say fight for your rights, fight for your beliefs, nobody interprets that as literal violence. This is a selective interpretation designed to prosecute me politically. But Mr. President, Margaret continued, her voice steady and measured, the context matters here. You had been telling your supporters for weeks that the election was stolen, that their country was being taken from them, and then you directed them to the Capitol on the exact day that the certification was taking place. Can you understand why people see a direct connection between your words and the actions that followed? Trump's response was immediate and heated. What I understand, Margaret, is that I am being blamed for the actions of individuals who made their own choices. I never told anyone to break into the Capitol. I never told anyone to assault police officers. Those people made their own decisions, and they should be held accountable for their own actions. But this attempt to blame me for everything that happened is nothing more than a political witch hunt. Margaret did not relent. Several members of Congress and your own staff pleaded with you during the riot to tell your supporters to leave the Capitol. It took you several hours to release a video message. Why did you wait so long to act when the Capitol was under siege? Trump's frustration was palpable. Margaret, that is not accurate. I was watching the situation unfold. I was being briefed, and I was trying to understand what was actually happening. The timeline that the media presents is completely wrong. We were dealing with a chaotic situation, and we acted as quickly as we could to assess and respond. Mr. President, Margaret pressed, witnesses have testified under oath that they begged you to intervene sooner, that they pleaded with you to tell your supporters to go home. Are all of these witnesses lying? Trump waved his hand dismissively. Margaret, some of these so-called witnesses have their own agendas. Some of them are people who were fired or who left on bad terms. They are using this as an opportunity to attack me and to sell books and get media attention. I do not trust their testimony, and neither should the American people. Let us talk about your current legal challenges, Margaret transitioned. You are facing multiple criminal indictments in different jurisdictions. Do you believe that all of these cases are politically motivated? Or do you acknowledge that you might have made errors in judgment? The question struck a nerve. Trump leaned forward aggressively, his voice rising once again. Margaret, this is the most obvious case of political persecution in American history. You have prosecutors who ran on a platform of getting Trump, who promised their constituents that they would prosecute me, and now they are doing exactly that. This is not justice. This is weaponization of the legal system. Margaret maintained her composure. But, Mr. President, these indictments were brought by grand juries, which are made up of ordinary citizens. Are you saying that all of these citizens in different parts of the country are part of a conspiracy against you? Trump did not hesitate. Margaret, these grand juries only hear what the prosecutors want them to hear. It is a one-sided process. The defense does not get to present evidence. The grand jury hears a carefully curated version of events designed to secure an indictment. As the saying goes, a prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich if they wanted to. These grand juries were manipulated. Margaret pushed forward. Let us focus on the documents case specifically. You had classified materials at your residence after leaving office. The National Archives repeatedly asked for their return. When a subpoena was issued, not all documents were returned, which led to the search. Why did you retain these documents, and why did you not simply comply with the subpoena? Trump's answer came quickly, his tone defensive and argumentative. First of all, Margaret, I had the right to those documents under the Presidential Records Act. I declassified them. I had every right to have them. Second, we were cooperating with the archives. This raid on my home was completely unnecessary and unprecedented. It was a political stunt designed to embarrass me and my family. Margaret did not let the answer stand unchallenged. Mr. President, legal experts, including former officials from your own administration, have said that declassification requires a formal process and documentation. Can you provide evidence that you formally declassified these documents? Trump's frustration mounted. Margaret, the president has ultimate declassification authority. I could declassify documents simply by deciding they were declassified. I do not need to fill out paperwork or go through some bureaucratic process. That authority rests with the president, and I exercised it. But if that is the case, Margaret countered, why do the documents still have classification markings on them? Why was there no record of declassification in the normal channels? And why did your own lawyers initially certify that all documents had been returned when in fact many remained? Trump's voice grew louder and more insistent. Margaret, you are asking me to defend against accusations in an ongoing legal case. My lawyers have advised me on what I can and cannot say. But what I can tell you is that this entire case is a sham. It is selective prosecution. There are other presidents and officials who took documents, who mishandled classified information, and they were never prosecuted. Why am I being singled out? Margaret was ready with her response. You are referring to other cases, but the circumstances were different. In those cases, the individuals cooperated fully with investigators and returned materials promptly when asked. The allegation in your case is not just about retention, but about obstruction. Can you see the distinction? Trump shook his head emphatically. No, Margaret, I do not see the distinction. What I see is a two-tiered justice system where people who are politically connected get treated with kid gloves, and people like me who threaten the establishment get prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. That is not equal justice, that is political targeting. The interview had now stretched past the halfway mark, and neither participant showed any signs of backing down or finding common ground. Margaret glanced down at her notes, visibly preparing for her next series of questions. The air in the studio felt electric, charged with the tension of everything that had been said, and everything that was still to come. Mr. President, I want to ask you about your rhetoric regarding the media. You have called journalists the enemy of the people. You have called news organizations fake news, and you have encouraged your supporters to distrust mainstream media outlets. Do you believe that this kind of language has contributed to threats and violence against journalists? Trump's response was swift and unapologetic. Margaret, the media has been incredibly unfair to me and to my supporters. You people twist our words. You take things out of context. You create narratives that are designed to damage us politically. When I call out fake news, I am not attacking journalism, I am attacking dishonest journalism. There is a big difference. Margaret leaned forward. But Mr. President, journalists have received death threats. Some have been attacked at your rallies, and many have had to hire security details because of threats from your supporters. Do you feel any responsibility for creating an environment where journalists feel unsafe? Trump shook his head vigorously. Margaret, I am not responsible for the actions of every person who supports me. If someone makes threats or commits violence, that is on them, not on me. What I am responsible for is telling the truth and calling out the media when they lie about me and my administration. That is my right and my responsibility. But does calling us the enemy of the people, Margaret pressed, not cross a line? Those words have historically been used by authoritarian regimes to justify suppressing the press. Do you understand why journalists find that language threatening? Trump leaned back, his expression dismissive. Margaret, you are being dramatic. I am not suppressing anyone. You are on television right now interviewing me. Does that look like suppression to you? What I am doing is fighting back against a media establishment that has been completely biased and unfair. If you do not like being called out, then maybe you should try reporting the news honestly. Let us talk about your future plans, Margaret transitioned. You have announced your candidacy for the next presidential election. If you were to win, what would your priorities be and how would your second term differ from your first? Trump's demeanor shifted slightly, his tone becoming more enthusiastic as he moved to more comfortable territory. Margaret, my second term would be even more successful than my first because now I know how the system works. I know who the good people are and who the bad people are. I know which agencies need to be cleaned out and reformed. We would finish the wall. We would secure the border completely. We would bring back American manufacturing. We would restore law and order to our cities. And we would make America energy independent again. Margaret nodded, but her follow-up was pointed. Mr. President, you mentioned cleaning out agencies and knowing who the bad people are. Does that mean you would use the power of the presidency to target people you consider political enemies? Trump's eyes narrowed. Margaret, there you go again, twisting my words. What I mean is that there are people in the federal bureaucracy who worked against my agenda, who leaked information, who slow-walked policies, who actively tried to undermine an elected president. Those people should not be in government. That is not targeting enemies. That is good management. But Mr. President, Margaret continued, the civil service exists to provide continuity and expertise regardless of which party is in power. Are you suggesting that career government employees should be fired if they do not agree with your policies? Trump did not hesitate. Margaret, if someone cannot implement the agenda that the American people voted for, then yes, they should be replaced. We do not have room for people who think they know better than the elected president and who work to sabotage policies they personally disagree with. That is not how democracy works. Margaret pressed further. Critics would argue that what you are describing sounds like a purge of anyone who disagrees with you, which would undermine the independence of federal agencies. How do you respond to those concerns? Trump's voice rose again. Margaret, those critics are the same people who cheered when the deep state was working against me during my first term. They had no problem with political interference when it was directed at me. Now that I am talking about holding people accountable and making sure the government actually works for the American people, suddenly they are concerned about independence. That is hypocrisy. Let me ask you about NATO and our international alliances. Margaret shifted topics. You have suggested that the United States might not defend NATO allies who do not spend enough on defense. Does not that statement undermine the entire premise of collective security that has kept the peace in Europe for decades? Trump leaned forward. Margaret, what undermines NATO is when we have countries that do not pay their fair share, that freeload off American taxpayers while we provide the majority of the defense. I said what I said to put pressure on these countries to step up and meet their obligations. And guess what? It worked. After I made those statements, defense spending among NATO allies increased significantly. But Mr. President, Margaret countered, threatening to abandon allies emboldens adversaries like Russia. Do you not see how that kind of rhetoric plays into Putin's hands? Trump's response was sharp. Margaret, nobody has been tougher on Russia than me. I provided lethal aid to Ukraine. I sanctioned Russian oligarchs. I increased our military presence in Eastern Europe. The previous administration sent blankets and meals. I sent weapons. But the media never wants to talk about that, do they? Margaret did not back down. Mr. President, you also met with Vladimir Putin multiple times. You praised him publicly, and you sided with him over your own intelligence agencies regarding election interference. How do you reconcile those actions with claiming you were tough on Russia? Trump's frustration was evident. Margaret, diplomacy requires dialogue. You have to talk to adversaries if you want to prevent conflicts. I was trying to improve relations with Russia because the alternative is conflict and potentially war. That does not mean I was soft on Russia. It means I was smart about how to handle a complicated relationship. The interview was now approaching its final minutes, but neither participant seemed willing to soften their approach. Margaret looked at her notes one last time before posing what would be her final question. Mr. President, I want to end by asking you something personal. You have been in the public eye for decades. You have been president. You are now running again while facing multiple legal challenges. What drives you to continue? Why not retire and enjoy your life away from all of this controversy and conflict? Trump paused for a moment, and for the first time in the interview, his expression softened slightly. Margaret, I love this country. I love the American people, and I cannot stand by and watch what is happening to our country. We are being destroyed from within by bad policies, by weak leadership, by people who do not put America first. I have the experience, I have the knowledge, and I have the strength to fix these problems. That is why I am running. That is why I will never give up fighting for the American people. Margaret gave a slight nod. Mr. President, thank you for joining us today. I think our viewers have certainly seen a very spirited discussion. Trump stood up, his expression returning to its familiar combative stance. Margaret, thank you for having me, even though I disagree with about 90% of your questions. And there you have it, one of the most explosive political interviews in recent memory. The tension, the confrontation, the complete refusal from both sides to give an inch of ground. This was not your typical softball interview, and it was not a conversation where either participant walked away feeling satisfied. So now I want to hear from you. After watching this entire interview, whose side are you on? Do you think Margaret asked fair questions, or was she too aggressive? Do you think Trump defended himself effectively, or did he deflect too much? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and let me know what you think about this absolute powder keg of an interview.